All right, let's talk about fungi. I really, really, really like mushrooms. I think it's really fun to go out and find them, to explore the different kinds that exist. And I would probably yell at my younger self because I had a chance to work in a mycology lab, so a lab that studies fungi, mycology being the study of fungus. And I worked in the lab for the mycology class as an assistant, and I helped go out and find mushrooms. And at that point in time, I was like, mushrooms are lame. I don't care. And now that I'm getting older, it's kind of like bird watching. It sneaks up on you. And I am constantly looking for fungi. In fact, both of the pictures on this particular slide I took, and I took them so that I could illustrate just some of the variety that we see within the fungi here in North Carolina. But in addition, so I could talk about the particular characteristics. So when you see a mushroom, you are seeing the very tiniest tip of the iceberg of a fungus. Fungi are eukaryotes, so they're just like our protists and plants in that they have the nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Okay, but fungi are a little different because they can be unicellular or multicellular. Most fungi are multicellular, and the ones I have in these images here are multicellular. Your yeasts, like what you use to make bread dough, that yeast is going to be a unicellular fungus. I remember learning when I was in elementary school that fungi were plants because they grow very similarly to what we see plants. They are kind of like flowers in that they have these reproductive parts that are very short-lived, relatively speaking, and that are kind of unique in they produce spores. And so for a long time we thought that fungi were plants, but they are not. Fungi are not even closely related to plants. Fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants because fungi are chemoheterotrophs. So just like us, it means that they get their nutrition from eating other things, but they absorb their food. So they grow into their food and they release enzymes that break the food down outside of their bodies, and then they absorb that through the body of the fungus, which is not the mushroom, that is just the reproductive part. Fungi are not modal, which is why they cannot be animals, because in general, animals have a form of movement. And fungi are weird in their reproduction. They reproduce through spores. And so spores are going to be produced by the mushrooms in these spore producing structures. A lot of times they're little folds or they might be pores, but they are going to reproduce sexually in that way. They do reproduce asexually because they are constantly growing into their food sources, and you can have a whole huge area of fungi that you'll never even see. They're underneath your feet all the time. So why do I say that fungi are really cool and I took these pictures in a particular way? So these are two different mushrooms that we can find here in North Carolina. This first one is called a death cap angel mushroom. It is a kind of Amanita species. And the reason I took this picture is I moved some of the needles and things out of the way, and there's this white fuzz at the base of this fungus. And the same thing on this bracket fungus. I can't remember what this one's called off the top of my head. But in the wood, we see these white cobwebby, sort of spiderweb looking structures. Now, for a long time, I remember even as a kid thinking that they were spider webs. They're not. That is the actual body of the fungus. So that is the actual portion of the fungus that is the main part that is growing and feeding and doing all of the fungal properties. And then the mushroom that we see is just a part that is produced to reproduce, similar to what we see in flowers. But remember, fungi are not plants at all. Okay. Now, fungi generally have, in the multicellular fungus, various structures that I want you to be aware of. So you will be asked to know these, okay? On the bottom, we have our mycelia. That's what we call the main body of the fungus. So all of this white fuzzy structure in these two images here is what we would consider the mycelium. Looking at the mycelium, it's very, very hard to differentiate the fungus, but if you were to go out into the woods and flip over a log or find a piece of dead and decomposing wood, you're going to find the mycelium usually growing throughout the wood in a visual sense. So we will find the body of the fungus in that sort of material, or if you're digging through the dirt or you're looking at roots of plants, a lot of times we have mycelium closely associated to those. When you see the mushroom, that is only the reproductive portion, and the mushroom is made up of hyphae, but so is the mycelia. So our fungal cells are called hyphae. They're these really complex cellular structures that are allowing the body of the fungus to even be very, very, very large. Like the largest living land organism is a fungus. So it's allowing these organisms to be very, very, very large and share nutrients and resources amongst them. And it is going to make up the mushroom part as well. If you ever get a mushroom, even the white button mushrooms from the store, and you kind of break it, instead of cutting it, you like break it and kind of peel it in a way, you'll see it almost looks a little bit hairy and fuzzy. And that is that mycelium, that is that hyphae that's making up that structure. Okay. Fungal walls do have a thick cell wall composed of chitin, and that is analogous to the plant cell walls because plant cell walls are made of cellulose. So we called them cell walls because they were similar in how they looked, but they are not made of the same material. Okay, so you will be asked to know the different parts of the fungus. So let's talk about some of the ecological impacts of fungus, because this is actually where it gets really interesting. So fungi are incredibly important decomposers. In fact, if you are interested, I have a fantastic documentary on Canvas called The Wonderful World of Fungi. It's the 2018 Best Documentary winner, and it's actually based out of NC State, so, that's kind of cool. But it talks about the evolutionary history of fungi and how we wouldn't have had land plants without fungi. We probably wouldn't have soil without fungi. And we absolutely would not have a fantastic nutrient cycling system because fungi decompose remains of plants, animals, and microbes. That is their main purpose. So when you get something like a strawberry that's got fungus growing on it, and you're like, oh, I got a moldy strawberry. Right, but that's literally the fungi's job. That is its job, is to recycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem. So they play a hugely important role there. And in fact, fungi are the only organisms that actually can break down wood. And so when you see things like termites living in wood, they're there because the fungi were there first. They are incredibly important in that decomposition process, as well as bacteria. Okay, they are actually really cool because they do sometimes eat animals as a nitrogen source, and there is an episode of This Podcast Will Kill You on coccidiomycosis, which talks about the evolutionary history of like what happened after dinosaurs died because of the asteroid. And there's some thoughts that the fungal explosion from the decomposition played a role in how mammals are. It's absolutely like mind-blowing. But we do know that some fungi can use animals as a nitrogen source. So if you've ever had athlete's foot or ringworm, that is a common skin fungus that is using you as a food source. Now, most fungi can't affect mammals as well because mammals are at a different body temperature and they're actually at a higher temperature than what fungi can do. But some of the ones that are famous and actually causing some huge problems across the globe are things like chytrid and white nose syndrome. So I have a picture on here of a little frog, and this frog is dead or dying. This frog is infested with what's known as chytrid fungus. And chytrid has led to a huge decimation of the frog populations worldwide. Because what chytrid does is it gets into the frog's skin and it causes its skin to thicken. It produces more keratin as part of the infection. And then the frog cannot do gas exchange effectively. And if frogs can't do gas exchange effectively, can't breathe properly, right? You can't do gas exchange, you're going to lose the ability to do cellular respiration. Chytrid is a naturally occurring fungus in some parts of the globe, but because we're in a more global environment, it has been introduced into a lot of populations that did not have any sort of natural immune resistance to it. And there are some populations that are now extinct in the wild because we cannot put the frogs back into the wild. There are breeding programs for a lot of these, but if we put them back into the wild, the chytrid is still there. It's a very small fungal cell and you just can't get rid of it. So that's something that's causing some problems. And then another one is the white nose syndrome in bats. So, white nose syndrome in bats has also led to a massive decline of bat populations in the United States. It was introduced, we believe, unintentionally. It's not ever like an intentional thing. Someone who was caving over in Europe was going through and looking at caves and things, appears to have gotten this fungus on their shoes, and their shoes were not cleaned before they were caving and going through what's called a hibernacula, a very large cave system that is where bats go to hibernate. And the fungus was introduced in that way. The bats in that hibernacula had been being a part of a study for a very long time. And when they went out to do annual surveys of numbers and species, they walked into the cave and were walking through knee deep piles of bat corpses. So, white nose syndrome is a devastating fungal infection that actually is called white nose syndrome because when the fungus gets to a certain point, it starts developing this fuzzy white structure around the nose of the bats and on their wings, and it causes them to rouse constantly from their hibernation and use up all their fat and energy reserves, and then they end up dying. It's really sad. One that's actually really cool and not actually that sad, arguably, is the cordyceps fungi. This is known as the zombie fungus. And if you're into zombie stories, it is the basis of The Last of Us and The Girl with All the Gifts. I love the zombie trope. I think it's great. And I love when it's caused by cordyceps. I think it's fantastic. But cordyceps fungi is very species specific. It is very host specific, and it can control insect populations from getting too large. It does feed on the insects themselves, and so it's not like cordyceps jumps right to humans. Again, we're not the right temperature for that, but it can be really beautiful. And there's a fantastic BBC clip from one of the planet Earths that goes through cordyceps. So if you just Google cordyceps BBC on YouTube, you'll find that video. It's beautiful. Okay. Personally, I think one of the things that interests most people is how plant diseases can lead to food spoilage. So this is where you get your molds, smuts, and rusts. Smuts and rusts are a kind of fungus, but don't go Googling. You have to be careful if you're Googling for those ones. But let's talk about food spoilage, right? When we talk about plants, so you've gone to the store and you've gotten a case of strawberries, right? You got a packet of strawberries, and you get home and you realize that some of the strawberries have a slight discoloration. And if you leave them long enough, that area where that slight discoloration is will start to grow a fuzz. That fuzz is a mold. That mold is the reproductive part of the fungus. So throughout the body of that strawberry, what you're not seeing is the mycelial parts that are going through and releasing enzymes that are breaking down that food to absorb it. That's why moldy foods tend to get kind of mushy when it's a fruit, because there are enzymes that are breaking that fruit down so that the fungi can kind of slurp up all of those good nutrients. So that's one of the things you see. And if you find a moldy spot, by that point, the mycelia throughout the entire fruit. And the same thing as your bread. So underneath the strawberry picture here, where you can see the discoloration and some of that fuzziness, I have an up close picture of a bread mold. I grew up in a family where if there was mold on your bread, you just picked it off and ate the bread anyway. And I would always argue that I could taste it, and my mom would tell me I was crazy. Turns out I can taste it, and I can smell mold from across the house because my husband has opened bread, and I've been like, "That's bad." I'm like Remy the rat from Ratatouille because I can smell. I have a bloodhound nose. When you do see the spots of mold forming on your bread, at that point, there's mycelia already through the entirety of that bread. And again, it is food spoilage. It can be really, problematic for people, especially people who have like food scarcity issues. Um, is it going to hurt you if you eat the bread and you pick the piece of mold off? No. Okay. There are moldy cheeses, and we do that intentionally. That's what blue cheese is the mold. So it's not the end of the world. Speaking of foods that we actually eat, so this is something that I think is just fascinating. So in the image of the corn, there are these large growths that are a grayish color off some of the kernels of corn. That is called a corn smut. And it is actually seen as a delicacy. This is grown a lot of times in Mexico, and when people find it, they're really happy about it because that is considered a food, like a delicacy, and they make they make different foods out of it. But it is a fungal infection, so it is a fungal infection that is affecting the seeds of these corn, and each of those corn kernels, when it's infected, can grow its own fungus. So that is a corn smut. I know it's called a smut. It's scientists are funny in how they name things. So these are some of the ecological impacts of fungi. Remember, I'm talking about some of the bad things. In general, fungi are incredibly important in decomposition, and really indispensable in the environment. We cannot just get rid of fungi. I think every semester I have someone who goes, "Well, how do I get rid of the mushrooms in my yard?" I'm like, you can't, because underneath your yard is just miles and miles and miles of mycelia. And the reason that that often exists is because a lot of these fungi are mutualistically bound to different plants. A lot of fungi fall within, not all, but a lot of fungi do have mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi do help plants grow more successfully, and fungi are very closely associated to plants. A lot of scientists are calling this the wood wide web because we do think that plants can communicate effectively through their fungal connections. In addition, that the hyphae increases the surface area. And so the fungi is going to bring in additional nutrients, and the plant uses those nutrients to make sugars and feeds that back to the fungus. So it is a symbiotic relationship. One of the things that was really interesting, though, is we didn't actually believe or know that mycorrhizal fungi were symbiotic. For quite a while, we as humans thought that they were harmful to plants, and so plants would be irradiated to remove the mycorrhizal fungi. And this is an example of that I have in the image here. These are two basil plants. And the basil plant on the left is very small. You can hopefully see that the roots are not very well developed, so there aren't as many leaves. The stem is not as thick. And overall, if you were picking out a plant at like a farmer's market to take home, this would not be the one you picked if the plant on the right was also available. The plant on the right has a larger density of leaves. It has a very thick root system and a very thick stem system, and is arguably a healthier, more productive plant. And that's because the plant on the right was grown with the mycorrhizal fungi. There was a study done in the 1950s to see about the impacts of mycorrhizal fungi on plant growth. And so I have a graph here as well that illustrates that the control plants, in the 5 years that they studied them, this is a pine tree, they measured the height of plants grown without mycorrhizal fungi, and the plants grew from maybe 1.5 feet to maybe 2 feet tall. But the plants that were grown with mycorrhiza were added to the root systems when those plants were planted, actually grew in 5 years from about 1.5 feet tall to almost 6 feet tall. That is a huge, significantly different height that shows us that the mycorrhiza can be incredibly important for plant growth. Again, most of these are going to be very specific to the plants that they actually inhabit, and a lot of the fungi we see growing in our yards, especially after a rainy period of time, are symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi with plant roots, and then they're just growing because that's what they do, right? In order to reproduce, you're going to have mushrooms sprout. So no, you cannot get rid of the mushrooms in your yard. And in fact, it's probably really bad if you tried to get rid of them in your yard. Okay. What are some of the economic impacts of fungi? Well, there's tons of them. The biggest one is that fungi was the original source of penicillin, which changed the entire future of human history. For a very long time, if you got any sort of infection, you just hoped you could get over it. If you got a really bad cut and it got infected, like, you hope that your body can handle it. Having penicillin, having some of these antibiotics has made a huge change in human health and well-being. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't overuse antibiotics. Okay, we absolutely do. If you have a cold, remember that's a virus, and so the antibiotic isn't going to help you. But fungi are an area of research for more antibiotics. A lot of them that we use have come from fungi, and we do think that a lot of them still potentially produce antibiotic-like substances that we can use. Yeast fermentation used to make bread, beer, and wine, absolutely huge and important to human history as well. Mushroom consumption has steadily increased in the United States. I'm a big fan of the Four Sigmatic coffee mix, but it's a mushroom coffee mix. And it has lion's mane, chaga, rhodiola, rosea, I don't know what that is. Um, I like this is an instant coffee. I think that this has a really nice flavor where most instant coffees don't. And there's some research that suggests that having certain mushrooms in your food source, in your diet, can be really beneficial. Um, Eastern medicine has used mushrooms for a very, very long time, and Western medicine is starting to pick up on that. And there's been a huge uptick in the amount of research going into mushrooms as a way of helping with memory loss or helping with blood pressures. And so there is something to be said there. We do know that fungal diseases are on a rise with changing temperatures. If you go listen to the coccidiomycosis episode of This Podcast Will Kill You, that is something that they do talk to. Um, it's absolutely fascinating. We also, I think in general, people are becoming more and more interested in like the homesteading lifestyle or the back to the earth, getting your food yourself lifestyle. And so a lot of people have been going out and foraging mushrooms. I don't eat wild mushrooms. Okay. I know how to identify mushrooms and I am very confident in my ability to determine if something is edible or not. But because mushrooms are so similar to us in a lot of ways, they can produce allergic reactions. And just because things like deer and squirrel eat the mushrooms doesn't mean that it's safe for you to do. So, unless you are 100% sure in what you are doing, I wouldn't eat wild mushrooms. That being said, you can find a lot of different kinds of mushrooms. Like, I love oyster mushrooms. Lion's mane mushroom is some of the most delicious mushroom ever. I hate the little white ones, the portobello and whatever mushrooms at the store. Those are disgusting. Will not eat those. But you can buy them. You can also buy grow kits from things like Amazon and Walmart or Target, even I've seen them. And you just kind of spritz it with water. It's a wood block that's got that mycelia in it already. It's seeded with mycelia. And so if you keep it damp, it produces mushrooms. And they are delicious. I strongly recommend increasing maybe your mushroom consumption. You can get dried shiitake mushrooms that are delicious. I'm just always really hesitant about foraging unless you know what you're doing because even experts make mistakes and die from eating poisonous fungi every year. So just to throw that out there, you can always see what's local. It's a little harder here in Jacksonville if you're here. The farmers market isn't as great as some other places I've lived because we live in a harsh environment. It's hard to grow a lot of things. But if you ever make it out towards Raleigh, there are some places that have mushrooms like this for sale at the farmers market that are delicious. Or you can grow your own by getting just a little grow kit. Seeding your own plants with mushrooms, like the oyster mushrooms do really well here in North Carolina, and so do lion's mane, but they have to be in the right kind of wood in order to grow effectively. So you can do some research into that if you're curious. That's all I have on fungi. Make sure that you can answer these simple questions here and make sure that you can tell the difference between fungi, animals, and plants. We are going to talk about animals in our next chapter unit. Before you start chapter 19, I'd like you to brainstorm. I want you to give yourself like a minute and just write down as many animals as you can, and we'll see what you come up with. I'm willing to bet that I have an idea of what most of you will list as an animal. So let's see what we can come up with. Thank you.